Before there was destruction, there was stillness. The mountain rose above the bay, its slopes green with vineyards and olive groves, its peak crowned with forest that provided timber for the ships in the harbor below. Vesuvius was not feared because Vesuvius was not known. The eruption that had buried earlier settlements lay so far in the past that even their ruins were forgotten, covered by the soil that centuries of peace had accumulated. The towns at the mountain's base prospered. Pompeii, with its forum and theaters and temples, was a thriving commercial center, its streets busy with merchants and craftsmen, its walls decorated with paintings that celebrated wine and love and the pleasures of civilized life. Herculaneum, smaller and more refined, housed wealthy Romans who maintained seaside villas with views across the bay. Stabii, Oplontes, other settlements ringed the mountain, drawn by the same fertility that the mountain's previous violence had created. The soil was exceptional. Volcanic ash, weathered over centuries, had become the richest agricultural land in Italy. The wines of Vesuvius were celebrated throughout the Roman world. The grain grew tall, the olives heavy, the gardens lush with flowers that bloomed in profusion. The mountain gave abundantly, and those who lived on its slopes saw no reason to fear what they had never witnessed. But the mountain remembered what humans had forgotten. Beneath the surface, magma had been accumulating for nearly 2 millennia. The pressure had been building since an eruption around 1800 BCE, an eruption so violent that it had buried Bronze Age settlements, that had sent ash across the Mediterranean, that had perhaps contributed to climate disruptions felt as far as China. The Romans did not know this history. The geological record lay buried beneath the very soil that sustained them. The signs were there for those who knew how to read them. Earthquakes had struck the region for years. In 62 CE, a major earthquake had damaged Pompeii so severely that repairs were still ongoing 17 years later when the final destruction came. Wells had gone dry. Springs had changed their flow. The small tremors that periodically shook the region were explained away as local phenomena, as the settling of the earth, as nothing to worry about. The final morning was ordinary. Bread was baked in ovens. Merchants opened their shops. Children played in streets. The wealthy reclined in their villas, enjoying the late summer warmth. A man named Pliny, commanding the Roman fleet across the bay at Misenum, was at his studies when someone called his attention to an unusual cloud rising above Vesuvius, a cloud shaped like a pine tree, its trunk a column of smoke rising high into the sky. Before spreading into branches, the mountain had begun to breathe, or rather, it had begun to exhale what it had been holding for 18 centuries. The pressure that had been building beneath the surface found release through the vent at the summit. Rock that had been liquid in the earth's depths was thrown into the sky, solidifying as it rose, falling back as pumice. Light, porous stones that accumulated quickly on rooftops and in streets. The first phase was survivable. The pumice fall was heavy, but not immediately deadly. Those who fled early, who took the roads north and east, away from the mountain, had time to escape. But many stayed to protect property, stayed because the pumice fall seemed like something that would end, stayed because leaving everything behind seemed worse than waiting out the storm. The pumice accumulated. Roofs began to collapse under the weight. The darkness that had descended when the ash cloud blocked the sun created confusion, made navigation difficult, trapped people in buildings they could not find their way out of. And then came the surges. In the early morning hours of the second day, the column of eruption collapsed. Instead of rising into the atmosphere, the superheated mixture of gas and rock flowed down the mountain's slopes at speeds exceeding 100 miles per hour, at temperatures exceeding 500 degrees. The surges killed instantly, not through burning, but through thermal shock, through the inhalation of air so hot that it stopped hearts and boiled brains within skulls. The first surge reached Herculaneum. The later surges reached Pompeii. Within hours, both cities were dead. The mountain continued to exhale for days. Ash accumulated, covering the bodies, filling the streets, burying the buildings, transforming a populated landscape into a gray desert. When the eruption finally ended, nothing remained visible of the towns that had been. The survivors, returning to find their homes, found instead featureless fields of ash. The precise locations of the cities were uncertain. The roads that had led to them were buried. Within a generation, the names themselves became geographical references rather than living memories. Places that had been, not places that were. Vesuvius returned to stillness. The mountain that had held its breath for centuries breathed again, then fell silent. The vineyards would return to its slopes. New settlements would rise. The cycle would continue as it continues today. The mountains sleeping, the humans farming, the memory of destruction fading faster than the fertility that destruction creates. The morning before the eruption was ordinary. The mountain gave no special warning that this day was different from any other. The bread was baked. The children played. The merchant opened his shop. And somewhere beneath the surface, the pressure that had been building found its release. The breath that had been held for 18 centuries finally escaped, and the kingdom that had been drawn in life was redrawn in ash. The excavators broke through hardened ash and found not ruins, but life, arrested, suspended, captured in the instant of its ending. The bread was still in the ovens. The wine was still in the cups. The dog was still straining against its chain, its body contorted in the desperate attempt to escape what could not be escaped. The rediscovery of Pompeii began by accident in 1748, when workers digging a canal struck ancient walls. Earlier excavations at Herculaneum had already revealed that something lay buried beneath the volcanic deposits. But Pompeii proved more accessible, buried under softer material, less thoroughly destroyed, more completely preserved. What emerged from the earth was unlike any other ancient site, not a ruin that had decayed over centuries, but a city that had been stopped, sealed, removed from time at the moment of its death. The preservation was extraordinary. Frescoes retained colors that would have faded within decades of exposure. Wooden furniture, carbonized by heat but protected by burial, maintained its forms. Foods that would have rotted in weeks remained recognizable after 17 centuries. Loaves of bread with the baker's stamp, eggs in their shells, fish prepared but never eaten. The ordinary objects of daily life, the things that normally disappear, survived because the disaster that destroyed the city also created an environment where decay could not proceed. But the most haunting preservation was of the people themselves. As bodies decomposed within the hardened ash, they left voids, negative spaces that maintain the shape of what had been. In the 19th century, archaeologist Giuseppe Fiorelli realized that these voids could be filled with plaster, creating casts that captured the positions of the dead at their moment of death. The results were extraordinary and disturbing. Figures frozen in postures of fear and resignation, of protection and flight, of ordinary activity interrupted by extraordinary ending. A man covers his mouth against the ash. A mother holds her children. Two women and a girl huddle together, their arms intertwined. A gladiator still wears the leg guards he never removed. A dog, tied in a courtyard, strains against its leash as the ash rises around it. A family gathers their valuables, preparing to flee, never making it out the door. The castes communicate across millennia, speak without words, testify to the final moments of people whose names we will never know. The preservation extends beyond bodies to behaviors. We can see what people did when they realized the end was coming. Some fled immediately, leaving everything behind. The survivors, whose bodies are not here because they escaped. Some gathered treasures, filling bags with coins and jewelry, valuables that would burden their flight and perhaps contribute to their deaths. Some hid in rooms, hoping the storm would pass, not understanding that no room could protect against what was coming. Some sought safety in basements, the worst possible choice, as the poisonous gases accumulated in low places. The excavations continue today, nearly 3 centuries after they began. Approximately two-thirds of Pompeii has been uncovered. The rest remains buried, preserved beneath the same ash that has protected it for nearly 2 millennia. Modern excavators work more slowly and more carefully than their predecessors, who sometimes damaged what they were trying to save in their eagerness to uncover it. Technology allows investigation without excavation, ground penetrating radar, laser scanning, methods that can reveal what lies beneath without disturbing it. But the uncovered city presents its own challenges. Exposed to air and weather after nearly 2,000 years of protection, the site is deteriorating. Frescoes fade in sunlight they were never meant to experience. Walls that stood for millennia collapse after decades of exposure. The preservation that burial created is undone by the revelation that excavation brings. The city that survived destruction is gradually succumbing to survival. The paradox is profound. Pompeii exists as we know it only because it was destroyed. The disaster that killed its people preserved their world. The ash that ended their lives maintained the evidence of how those lives were lived. Without the eruption, Pompeii would have continued as an ordinary town, its buildings rebuilt and modified over centuries, its artifacts discarded and replaced, its art painted over or torn down, its people buried in cemeteries that later generations would disturb or forget. The Pompeii that survived would bear no resemblance to the Pompeii that was buried, would have changed, evolved, become something different, eventually declined, and been abandoned like countless other ancient towns whose ruins tell us almost nothing about how people actually lived. The eruption stopped all that, stopped it violently, cruelly, indiscriminately, but stopped it, captured the city in a single moment, preserved that moment for future generations, created a time capsule that we can open but cannot fully understand. We walk the streets and see the grooves worn by cartwheels, the graffiti scratched by ancient hands, the fountains where ancient thirsts were quenched. We enter the houses and see the rooms where ancient families slept, ate, loved, argued, lived. We look at the faces cast in plaster and try to imagine the people who wore those faces, who had names and stories and relationships that the ash buried along with their bodies, the city preserved in the moment of its forgetting, not destroyed but stopped, not gone but held. The preservation that death creates, that life could never achieve. The moment that became eternal because it was allowed to end. Long before Vesuvius, another eruption had reshaped the ancient world. An explosion so violent that it blasted away the center of an island, sent tsunamis crashing against distant shores, and may have contributed to the collapse of the first great Mediterranean civilization. The eruption of Thera, the island we now call Santorini, occurred around 1600 BCE, and its effects rippled outward through time as well as space, perhaps inspiring the legend of Atlantis, perhaps ending the Minoan civilization, certainly demonstrating that volcanic destruction operates on scales that dwarf human understanding. The caldera is what remains, a vast bowl of sea surrounded by crescent islands that are the remnants of what was once a complete circle. The original island rose from the Aegean like a small mountain, its volcanic cone creating a landmark visible from far at sea. Minoan civilization had established a settlement there at the site we now call Akrotiri, a prosperous town of multi-story buildings and elaborate frescoes, of paved streets and sophisticated plumbing, of a culture that valued art and beauty and connection to the wider Mediterranean world. We know the settlement existed because it was preserved, buried like Pompeii by the eruption that destroyed it. But the preservation at Akrotiri is different. The inhabitants seem to have escaped. No bodies have been found. The earthquake that preceded the eruption apparently gave warning, allowed the population to flee, to take their valuables and their lives, and leave behind only their buildings and their art. What was buried was a city already abandoned, a shell that the eruption filled with pumice and ash, and then sealed for 35 centuries. The excavations at Akrotiri have revealed a world that challenges assumptions about Bronze Age societies. The buildings rose to 3 or 4 stories. The streets were paved and drained. The houses contained indoor toilets connected to sewer systems. The frescoes that decorated the walls depicted a sophisticated culture, ships sailing between ports, women gathering saffron, monkeys climbing rocks, boxers competing, fishermen displaying their catch. The art suggests a society that valued beauty, that had leisure for artistic creation, that was connected to Egypt and the Levant and the wider Mediterranean world. The Minoans who created this culture were based on Crete, the large island to the south, where the great palaces of Knossos and Phaistos and Malia had been built. These palaces were centers of a civilization that dominated the Aegean for centuries, a civilization without defensive walls, suggesting a security that came from naval power rather than fortifications, a civilization whose writing systems, Linear A, which we cannot read, and Linear B, which turned out to be an early form of Greek, recorded the administration of a complex society. The Minoans traded widely, influenced Greek civilization profoundly, and then declined relatively rapidly, relatively mysteriously, in ways that scholars still debate. The timing of Thera's eruption and Minoan decline is close enough to suggest connection, but the nature of that connection remains uncertain. The eruption was massive, one of the largest in human history, perhaps 50 times the size of Vesuvius in 79 CE. The explosion ejected cubic miles of rock into the atmosphere. The column of eruption rose perhaps 20 miles high before collapsing. The tsunamis generated by the caldera's collapse would have struck Crete's northern coast, where the major palaces were located, with devastating force. But the palaces were not immediately abandoned. Evidence suggests that they continued to be used after the eruption, that the Minoan civilization persisted for perhaps a century before its final decline. The relationship between natural disaster and cultural collapse was apparently not instantaneous, but gradual, weakening rather than destroying, creating vulnerability that later pressures exploited. The Mycenaean Greeks, who eventually took control of the palaces, may have conquered a civilization already weakened by the eruption's long-term effects, already struggling with disrupted trade routes and damaged agriculture. The legend of Atlantis enters here, though the connection is speculative. Plato described Atlantis as an island civilization that sank beneath the waves in a single day, a civilization that had been wealthy and powerful before its sudden destruction. He placed it beyond the Pillars of Hercules, in the Atlantic Ocean, but some scholars have suggested that his account distorts memories of Thera's eruption, that the Minoan civilization provided the model for Atlantean splendor, that the caldera's formation provided the model for a land swallowed by the sea. The theory cannot be proven, but the resonance is striking. An island civilization destroyed in a day, remembered only in stories that subsequent cultures transformed into myth. The caldera today is a tourist destination. Cruise ships anchor in the flooded crater. Visitors ride donkeys up the cliffs to whitewashed towns. Sunset watchers gather to see the light paint the water gold and rose. The beauty is extraordinary, and it is entirely a product of catastrophe. The cliffs that tourists admire are the exposed interior of a destroyed volcano. The bay where cruise ships anchor is the flooded crater. The islands that form the caldera's rim are fragments of what was once whole. Somewhere beneath those waters, beneath the sediment that has accumulated over 35 centuries, the original island's center may still exist. Collapsed rather than exploded, buried rather than destroyed. What might it contain? We cannot know without excavation that current technology makes impossible. The center that swallowed itself keeps its secrets in darkness and depth. The island that swallowed half itself. The civilization that flourished and fell. The legend that rose from catastrophe and transformed history into myth. The caldera remembers what the surface has forgotten. The water holds what the land released. The story continues, incomplete, waiting for readers who may never come. The ash that rises must eventually fall, and when volcanoes erupt with sufficient force, the ash circles the globe before settling. The local catastrophe becomes global event. The buried kingdom is joined by distant harvests that fail, by summers that never warm, by civilizations far from any volcano that suffer consequences they cannot understand. The mechanics are straightforward, but the effects are profound. Major eruptions inject sulfur dioxide into the stratosphere, where it combines with water to form aerosols, tiny particles that reflect sunlight back into space before it can warm the Earth. The cooling effect can last for years, can drop global temperatures by several degrees, can disrupt weather patterns across continents. The rain that falls for generations is not water, but the long aftermath of a single violent day. The Year Without a Summer, 1816, provides documented example of what volcanic winter means. Mount Tambora in Indonesia had erupted in April 1815, the largest eruption in recorded history, ejecting approximately 160 cubic kilometers of debris, killing tens of thousands immediately and many more through the famine that followed. The effects spread globally. In New England, frost occurred every month of 1816. In Europe, the harvest failed catastrophically. Food prices soared, riots erupted, migration accelerated as farmers abandoned lands that could no longer feed them. The cultural effects rippled outward. Mary Shelley, spending a gloomy summer in Switzerland, where the cold and rain kept her party indoors, wrote Frankenstein, a novel born from volcanic winter, from the apocalyptic mood that the strange weather created. Artists painted sunsets that were unusually vivid because the atmospheric particles scattered light in unfamiliar ways. The emigration from failed European farms helped populate the American Midwest. The connections extend further than any single account can trace. But 1816 is merely the most documented example of a recurring pattern. Major eruptions throughout history have affected climate, and the effects have contributed to historical crises whose causes seemed mysterious to those who suffered them. The eruption of Laki in Iceland in 1784 produced haze that darkened European skies, killed livestock, failed crops, and may have contributed to the social unrest that preceded the French Revolution. The eruption of an unknown tropical volcano around 536 created what has been called the worst year in human history. The sun dimmed for 18 months. Crops failed across the northern hemisphere. The plague of Justinian began its spread, and the ancient world entered a period of decline from which it would not fully recover for centuries. The connections between specific eruptions and specific historical events are often disputed. The evidence is circumstantial. Tree rings that show reduced growth, ice cores that preserve volcanic sulfate, historical accounts of unusual weather whose cause was not understood. The argument that a particular eruption caused a particular crisis requires assumptions about chains of causation that cannot be directly verified. Climate is complex, famines have multiple causes, and correlation is not causation. But the pattern is clear even if the specifics are disputed. Major volcanic eruptions affect global climate. Climate affects agriculture. Agricultural failure affects societies. The effects cascade through systems that are interconnected in ways that ancient peoples could not perceive, and modern people can only partially trace. The kingdom drawn in ash extends far beyond the mountain's shadow, extends to every field that failed because the sun was dimmed, to every family that starved because the harvest did not come, to every civilization that weakened because the climate shifted in ways no one understood. The ancient sources record strange phenomena without comprehending their cause. The sun that shone weakly for a year, the summer that never warmed, the crops that failed for reasons that no local explanation could explain. The ancient observers attributed these phenomena to divine displeasure, to cosmic disorder, to signs and portents that required interpretation. They could not know that somewhere on the other side of the world, a mountain had exploded, that ash was circling the globe in currents they could not perceive, that their suffering was connected to an event they would never hear of in lands they did not know existed, the rain that fell for generations, the ash that circled the earth, the connections that linked distant civilizations through atmosphere and climate, through particles too small to see and effects too large to escape. The kingdom that was buried, and the kingdoms that suffered without knowing why. connected by the air that carries what the earth releases, by the sky that receives what the ground expels, by the circulation that makes local catastrophe into global consequence. In the carbonized libraries of buried cities, writing survives in forms that challenge recovery, not as readable text, but as changed substance, as carbon where papyrus was, as impression where ink lay, as shadow where hand once moved across surface. The destruction that buried also preserved, but the preservation is partial, fragmentary, maddening in what it suggests, but cannot quite reveal. The villa of the papyri at Herculaneum contained one of the only intact libraries to survive from the ancient world. Nearly 2,000 scrolls were recovered from its rooms, not preserved like the books of later libraries, copied and recopied through centuries of transmission, but the actual objects that ancient hands had held, ancient eyes had read, ancient minds had contemplated. The library was a treasure beyond price, and it was unreadable. The pyroclastic flow that killed the villa's inhabitants also carbonized its contents. The scrolls that had been papyrus became charcoal, maintaining their form but transforming their substance. They looked like burned logs, like cylinders of coal, like nothing that could contain words, or thoughts, or the accumulated wisdom of Epicurean philosophy. When early excavators tried to open them, they crumbled. When later scholars developed techniques for unrolling, the process destroyed as much as it revealed. Fragments peeled away, lost their connection to larger contexts, revealed text that was incomplete and often illegible. For centuries, the scrolls remained largely unread. They were stored in the Naples Museum, occasionally examined, generally treated as artifacts rather than texts, objects whose existence was significant even if their contents were inaccessible. Scholars knew that the library contained works by Philodemus, an Epicurean philosopher whose writings had been lost except for what Herculaneum preserved. But knowing the library contained his works and reading those works were different things. The carbonized scrolls kept their secrets. Then technology changed what was possible. In the 21st century, researchers began using CT scanning, X-ray imaging that could see inside objects without opening them, to examine the scrolls. The technique was initially unsuccessful. Carbonized papyrus and carbonized ink are both carbon, and carbon looks the same to X-rays, regardless of its original form. But refinements in imaging and analysis began to detect differences, subtle variations in density, in structure, in the ways different carbon formations scattered X-rays. Machine learning accelerated the process. Algorithms trained on known letter shapes began identifying characters in the noisy data. What human eyes could not distinguish, trained neural networks could detect. Letters emerged from shadow. Words assembled from letters. Passages appeared that no one had read since the eruption buried them. The Vesuvius Challenge, launched in 2023, offered prizes for progress in reading the scrolls. Within months, researchers had identified hundreds of characters had read words and phrases, had begun to recover the content that 17 centuries of burial had hidden. The texts emerging from the carbonized scrolls add to our knowledge of Epicurean philosophy, a school of thought that had been poorly preserved through medieval transmission, that survived mainly through hostile accounts by Christian writers who considered its emphasis on pleasure heretical. What else might the scrolls contain? The villa's owner had connections to Rome's intellectual elite. The library might include works by major philosophers, by historians, by poets whose writings were lost in the general destruction of ancient literature. We cannot know until we read, and reading proceeds slowly, painstakingly, one passage at a time, each revealed word the product of enormous technological and intellectual effort. Beyond Herculaneum, other volcanic sites present similar challenges. The tablets of Akrotiri preserve Linear A, the Minoan script that remains undeciphered. The symbols are clear. The language they encode is unknown. We can see that the Minoans wrote, can recognize that their tablets recorded something, probably administrative information, lists of goods and people and transactions. But we cannot read what they recorded. The shadow of writing survives. The substance eludes us. The writing that survived only as shadows. The texts that exist in forms we cannot yet read. The knowledge preserved by destruction, hidden by preservation, waiting for technology or insight that will finally reveal what ancient hands recorded. The shadow speaks of presence that was once light. The carbon remembers that it was once ink on papyrus, once thought made visible, once communication that someone expected someone else to read. The reading continues. Each year brings new techniques, new recoveries, new glimpses of what the ash preserved. The shadow slowly becomes text. The silence gradually acquires voice. The writing that survived as shadows begins, word by word, to speak again. The relationship between land and sea is not fixed. Volcanic events can raise coastlines or drop them, can extend shores with new material or collapse them into calderas, can transform harbors into hills and seafronts into inland ruins. The kingdom drawn in ash includes not only what the ash buried, but what the volcanic forces reshaped. The harbors that sailed into stone, the coastlines that walked away from water. The ancient harbor of Herculaneum presents such a case. Excavators working in the 20th century found, far from modern water, the structures of a Roman seafront, boathouses, beach, the infrastructure of a maritime community. The harbor had been pushed inland by the volcanic material that buried it, not merely covered, but relocated. The relationship between land and sea permanently altered by the deposits that the eruption left behind. The boathouses contained surprises. Where archaeologists expected to find boats, they found bodies, 300 people huddled in the vaulted chambers where vessels had been stored, apparently seeking shelter from the eruption, apparently dying there when the pyroclastic surge reached them. The boathouses had become death chambers. the last refuge of people who had perhaps hoped to escape by sea but had been trapped when the harbor filled with volcanic debris. The bodies at Herculaneum were different from those at Pompeii. The intense heat of the pyroclastic surge had not merely killed, but had flash heated, had boiled fluids and cracked bones, and created patterns of destruction that modern forensics can analyze. The deaths were instant, too fast for suffering, too fast for postures of defense, too fast for anything except the sudden arrest of whatever motion the body was making when the surge arrived. Some had been trying to flee. One woman was found with an infant in her arms, another child at her side, apparently running toward the water when the heat stopped her. Others had been huddled together, perhaps families, perhaps strangers brought together by disaster. One man, apparently a soldier judging by his equipment, had been near the front of a boathouse, perhaps trying to organize evacuation, perhaps trying to secure the boats that represented the only escape route. The surge found them all. The boats themselves were partly preserved. The intense heat that killed the people had also carbonized the wooden vessels, transforming them into carbon that maintained their shape. Archaeological analysis has revealed details of Roman boat construction, of the vessels that carried commerce and passengers across the bay, of the maritime technology that connected Herculaneum to the wider Mediterranean world. The coastline today is different. The volcanic deposits that buried Herculaneum also extended the shore, pushed the waterline outward, created new land where water had been. The modern coast lies hundreds of meters from the ancient seafront. Visitors to the excavated boathouses are not standing near water but inland, surrounded by the urban development of modern Ercolano, the town that grew up unknowing above the buried city. The transformation extends beyond Herculaneum. Volcanic events throughout history have reshaped coastlines, have raised and lowered land relative to sea, have created and destroyed harbors. The land is not stable. The earth moves in ways that exceed human time frames, but are real and consequential. The harbor that served a generation may be inaccessible to the next. The seafront that supported a community may rise above the water or sink below it. The symbolic weight is considerable. The harbor represents connection, connection to other lands, other peoples, other possibilities. When the harbor sails into stone, the connection is severed. The maritime community becomes landlocked. The boats that carried trade and travel become artifacts of a capability that geography has removed. The kingdom drawn in ash includes this transformation, not only the burial of what existed, but the reshaping of the earth itself, the relocation of the boundary between land and sea, the creation of new geography from volcanic material that the earth expelled. The harbor that sailed into stone represents the scale of volcanic transformation, affecting not merely human constructions, but the very terrain on which humans built. The boathouses at Herculaneum remain excavated and exposed, their vaulted chambers open to visitors who can see where people died and where boats were stored. The sea they once faced is no longer visible. The escape route they represented no longer exists. The stone has sailed to where the water was, has carried the harbor with it, has transformed seafront into inland sight. On the slopes of volcanoes, temples were built, sacred sites positioned precisely because of their proximity to the mountain's power, sanctuaries that honored the force that would eventually destroy them. The relationship between the sacred and the volcanic was ancient and deliberate, a recognition that the mountain's power demanded acknowledgement, a hope that worship might bring protection. The temples of Vesuvius stood on slopes that farmers cultivated and priests attended. The Romans worshipped at shrines dedicated to Vulcan, the god of fire and metalworking, whose name would eventually give us the word volcano. They sought to propitiate the forces that made the earth shake and the ground steam, to negotiate a relationship with powers they could not control, but might perhaps influence through proper observance. The destruction of these temples was different from the destruction of houses and marketplaces. The sacred sites were not merely buried, but blasted. The pyroclastic surges that moved down the mountain's slopes hit these elevated positions with particular force, scattering stones that walls had contained, throwing upward what had been built upward. The temple that had reached toward sky returned to sky, carried on the surge that ended its purpose. Beyond Vesuvius, the, the pattern repeats across volcanic regions. The temples of Indonesia sit on slopes that have erupted and will erupt again, where the relationship between worship and danger remains active, where offerings are made to mountains that receive them with indifference or acceptance that no one can distinguish. The shrines of Mediterranean volcanic islands acknowledge the same forces, the vents where sulfur gases suggested proximity to underworld, the hot springs where healing waters emerged from depths no one could reach. The theology that built these temples is not simple superstition. It represents recognition of forces beyond human control, acknowledgement that the earth contains powers that demand respect, understanding that human prosperity depends on relationships with the non human world that cannot be commanded but might perhaps be negotiated. The farmer who plants on volcanic slopes knows that the soil's fertility comes from previous destruction, that the abundance he enjoys is gift from a giver who might reclaim it at any time. The destruction of the temple demonstrates the limits of such negotiation. The gods do not protect their own shrines. The worship offered does not prevent the destruction that worship sought to prevent. The relationship between human devotion and natural force is revealed as one-sided. Humans give, the mountain takes, or spares according to its own rhythms, and no amount of offering changes the outcome. But the temples were rebuilt on Vesuvius and on volcanic slopes around the world. The sacred sites destroyed by eruptions were restored, were rededicated, were returned to the purpose they had served before the mountain ended them. The faith that built the temple was not shattered by its destruction, but renewed by it. The power that destroyed demonstrated the importance of acknowledging that power. The catastrophe confirm the necessity of propitiation, even if propitiation could not guarantee protection. The cycle continues. Modern temples stand on volcanic slopes in Indonesia, in the Philippines, in Central America, in Japan. The worshippers know what the mountain can do, have seen it do similar things in living memory, in historical record, in geological evidence that even untrained eyes can read. They worship anyway. They acknowledge the power they cannot control. They hope, perhaps, that acknowledgement brings some benefit, or they accept that benefit and destruction are dispensed by forces that human worship cannot influence. The temple that fell upward into sky represents this relationship. The sacred site that reached toward what would destroy it. The worship that acknowledged what worship could not prevent. The faith that rebuilt what faith could not protect. The relationship between humans and volcanoes is not merely geological but spiritual, not merely a matter of soil fertility and eruption frequency, but of how humans understand their place in a world that exceeds their control. After the ash falls, after the survivors mourn, after the landscape lies barren beneath its gray covering, something unexpected happens. The garden returns. The soil that the eruption created becomes more fertile than what existed before. The destruction that ended one form of life creates conditions for another. The kingdom drawn in ash becomes, eventually, a kingdom drawn in green. The fertility of volcanic soil is legendary and well founded. The ash that falls contains minerals that the earth's depths released: potassium, phosphorus, calcium, the nutrients that plants require, the elements that ordinary soil gradually depletes. The weathering of volcanic ash creates soil of exceptional richness, capable of supporting agriculture more productive than what surrounding regions can achieve. Um, the farmers who return to volcanic slopes know this. They plant in soil that contains their ancestors' graves, that covers the streets where their grandparents walked, that preserves the cities they will never see. They accept the bargain that volcanic regions offer: fertility in exchange for risk, abundance in exchange for the possibility of loss, gardens that grow in destruction's memory and may become destruction's future. The vineyards of Vesuvius produce wines celebrated since Roman times, wines that the younger Pliny praised, wines that continued to be produced after the eruption that killed his uncle, wines that grow today in soil enriched by the catastrophe that buried the cities their labels commemorate. The grapes draw nutrients from ash that fell 2 millennia ago. The wine carries trace elements from the mountain's depths. The celebration of life grows from the substance of death. The pattern extends beyond Vesuvius. The rice terraces of Indonesia, carved into volcanic slopes, produce harvests that sustain dense populations. The coffee plantations of Central America flourish in soil that eruptions created. The orchards of Sicily, the, the farms of the Philippines, the Cotindos gardens of Japan. Volcanic soil produces abundance that justifies the the volcanic destruction. But the garden also represents something beyond practical agriculture. It represents resilience, the capacity of life to return after catastrophe, the refusal of the world to remain barren. The first green shoots that emerge from gray ash are symbols of hope that require no religious interpretation, natural processes, demonstrating that ending is not final, that destruction creates conditions for renewal, that what seems permanent emptiness is temporary stage in cycles that include return. The kingdom drawn in ash is not only the buried city, but the garden that grows above it. The preservation below ground is matched by renewal above it. The dead, their postures frozen in volcanic deposits, are overlaid by the living, their roots reaching into volcanic soil. The layers accumulate, city beneath garden, death beneath life, ending beneath renewal. The garden that grows in destruction's memory does not forget the destruction. The farmers know what lies beneath their fields. The winemakers understand that their grapes feed on catastrophe. The abundance they harvest is gift from forces that have given and may take away. The garden grows in memory, and memory is not erasure but acknowledgement, recognition that what exists now exists because of what happened before, that the green present grows from the gray past, that destruction and creation are not opposites but phases and cycles that exceed human lifespans. The most intimate preservation is of the human, not buildings or objects, but bodies, faces, the physical forms of people who became, through the accident of how they died, monuments to their own ending. The faces preserved in final expression speak across millennia, communicate without words, testify to what it was to be human in the moment when being human ended. The technique that revealed these faces was simple and profound. As bodies decomposed within the hardened ash of Pompeii, they left voids, spaces that maintained the shape of what had been. The ash had hardened around the corpses, preserving their forms even as the organic material within decayed. When Giuseppe Fiorelli realized in the 1860s that these voids could be filled with plaster, he gave form to absence, created positive images from negative space, made visible what time had hidden. The casts that emerged were haunting. A man covering his face, perhaps against the ash, perhaps in despair, perhaps in prayer. A woman reaching towards something or someone, her arm extended in gesture whose meaning we cannot know. A family group huddled together, their bodies intertwined, their faces turned toward each other in final communion. A dog twisted against its chain, its body contorted in desperate attempt to escape, its loyalty to a master who had fled without releasing it, rewarded by shared death. Each cast is individual. Each face carries expression that was unique to that person in that moment. The generalizations we might make about Pompeii's victims dissolve when we look at specific figures. This person, in this posture, with this expression, dying in this way. The humanity is unavoidable. We see not representatives of an ancient population, but individuals who had names, had histories, had relationships, and hopes and fears, had everything that constitutes a life, now reduced to this single captured instant. The ethics of display are complex. These are human remains, however transformed. They are people who did not consent to exhibition, who died in circumstances that no one would choose, who have become tourist attractions and educational materials and subjects of photographic reproduction. Do we honor them by preserving their memory, or do we exploit them by putting their deaths on display? The question has no comfortable answer. Modern technology has added new dimensions to the examination. CT scans of the casts have revealed skeletons within, have shown injuries and dental conditions and signs of diet and health, have made it possible to determine age and sex and physical condition. DNA analysis has been attempted, though the heat of the eruption often damaged genetic material beyond recovery. The faces that we see in plaster are being supplemented by data that the plaster conceals, information about who these people were that goes beyond how they died. Some figures have acquired names, though the names are speculative. The two maidens were long assumed to be young women based on their posture and apparent physique. CT scanning revealed that both were male, one possibly as old as 21. The muleteer was found with a donkey, apparently caring for the animal until the end. The identifications personalize, but may also mislead. We project narratives onto figures who cannot confirm or deny what we imagine about them. The faces preserved in the final expression remain silent about everything except the fact of their ending. They cannot tell us their names or their relationships, their beliefs or their fears, their lives before the moment when life stopped. They can tell us only that they died in postures that communicate something, that suggest fear or resignation or desperate hope or acceptance, that speak the universal language of human bodies under stress. The kingdom drawn in ash includes these faces. The preservation that buried the city also buried its people, captured them in their final expressions, held their postures across 17 centuries until technology could reveal what ash contained. The faces speak. The faces testify. The faces remind us that civilizations are not abstractions, but accumulations of individuals, each with a face, each with an expression, each with a final moment that was uniquely theirs. History becomes legend when the details are forgotten and the meaning remains. The volcanic destruction of ancient civilizations did not merely end those civilizations, but created stories that subsequent cultures transformed into myth. Stories of divine judgment, of catastrophic ending, of worlds swallowed by fire or water, of the impermanence of human achievement, and the permanence of powers that exceed human control. The legend of Atlantis provides the most famous example, though the connection to any specific volcanic event remains disputed. Plato described Atlantis as an island civilization that had been wealthy and powerful, that had threatened Athens and the Greek world, that had been destroyed in a single day and night of calamity. sinking beneath the waves to become memory and warning. He placed the island beyond the Pillars of Hercules in the Atlantic Ocean and specified that the destruction had occurred 9,000 years before his time, details that seem to preclude connection to any historical event. But Plato was writing philosophy, not history. His Atlantis story served didactic purposes, illustrating the corruption that follows excessive wealth, the hubris that precedes destruction, the moral lessons that catastrophe teaches. If his account distorted or combined memories of actual events, the distortion would have served his purposes rather than undermined them. The possibility that memories of Thera's eruption and Minoan decline contributed to the Atlantis legend has attracted scholarly attention. The chronology is wrong. Minoan civilization flourished 3,000 years before Plato, not 9,000, but oral tradition compresses and distorts time. The location is wrong. The Aegean is not the Atlantic, but Plato might have relocated a local story to make it seem more exotic. The details are wrong. Minoans did not threaten Athens, which barely existed in their era. But legends grow through addition and elaboration. What survived in legend that might connect to historical volcanic destruction? The image of an island swallowed by the sea, the idea of a sophisticated civilization destroyed in a single catastrophe, the sense that human prosperity is fragile, that powers exist that can end in a day what took generations to build. These themes appear in Atlantis and in the actual history of Thera and the Minoans, perhaps coincidentally, perhaps because legendary Atlantis preserves distorted memories of historical destruction. Beyond Atlantis, volcanic destruction generated other legends. The story of Sodom and Gomorrah, cities destroyed by fire from heaven for their wickedness, may preserve memory of volcanic or seismic events in the Dead Sea region, transformed by religious interpretation into moral lesson. The concept of Vulcan's forge, where the god of fire worked beneath mountains that occasionally erupted, explained volcanic activity through narrative, made comprehensible what would otherwise have seemed random or meaningless. The transformation of history into legend is not merely distortion, but a form of preservation. The specific details, which volcano, which year, which civilization, may be lost, but the significance is retained. The lesson that human prosperity is fragile, that powers exist beyond human control, that catastrophe can come suddenly and completely. These insights survive in legendary form long after the historical events that generated them are forgotten. The kingdom drawn in ash becomes the kingdom drawn in story. The destruction that ended historical civilizations generated legendary civilizations whose endings taught what the original endings had demonstrated. The ash that buried the kingdom became the narrative that preserved its meaning, transformed through the mysterious processes by which history becomes myth, by which specific events become universal symbols, by which what happened once becomes what can always happen. The geological record is a library that requires no scribes, that accumulates without intention, that preserves what no human archivist chose to preserve. The layers of volcanic deposit tell stories of eruptions that no one witnessed, record catastrophes that predated human presence, testify to patterns that will continue long after humans are gone. The archive written in layers of earth speaks of deep time, of cycles that exceed historical memory, of forces that shaped the world before history began and will continue to shape it after history ends. Scientists read this archive through multiple methods. Stratigraphic analysis examines the visible layers in exposed cliff faces, identifies different deposits by their color and texture and composition. Radiocarbon dating determines when organic material was buried by volcanic debris. Ice cores from Greenland and Antarctica preserve volcanic sulfate that circled the globe, providing calendar of major eruptions extending back hundreds of thousands of years. Tree rings record climate effects of volcanic aerosols, years of reduced growth that correlate with other evidence of major eruptions. The record that emerges from this analysis is sobering. Major volcanic eruptions occur regularly on geological timescales, not frequently enough to threaten each human generation, but frequently enough that every long-lived civilization has experienced them. The eruptions that buried Pompeii and ended the Minoans were not exceptional, but routine. Episodes and patterns that repeat across millennia. The archive shows that such eruptions have happened before and will happen again. That the question is not whether, but when. The archive also shows that volcanic catastrophe operates on multiple scales. The eruption of Toba in Indonesia, approximately 74,000 years ago, was vastly larger than any eruption in historical times, perhaps 1,000 times larger than Vesuvius, perhaps producing volcanic winter that lasted years rather than months, perhaps reducing human population to a few thousand individuals who survived to become the ancestors of everyone alive today. The genetic evidence suggests a population bottleneck. Around this time, though the connection to Toba remains debated, what is not debated is that eruptions of this scale have occurred and will eventually occur again. The archive cannot predict specific future eruptions, but it can identify patterns. Volcanoes that have erupted recently are monitored. Those that have been dormant for centuries are watched with particular concern, as pressure may have built during the long silence. The archive tells us what dormant volcanoes have done before, suggests what they may eventually do again, warns that the sleep of mountains is not permanence, but pause. The kingdom drawn in ash is recorded in these layers. The eruption that buried Pompeii left deposits that extend across southern Italy that can be traced to specific distance from the volcano, that reveal the direction and speed of pyroclastic flows. The eruption of Thera left ash deposits across the eastern Mediterranean, provided chronological markers for archaeologists trying to date sites throughout the region. Each major eruption wrote its signature in the geological archive, added pages to the library of the earth. We read this archive with humility. The layers tell stories of power that exceeds human scale, of time that exceeds human memory, of patterns that will continue regardless of human presence or absence. The archive was written before humans existed and will continue to be written after we are gone. Our civilizations, however sophisticated, however powerful, exist within parameters set by geological forces we can study but cannot control. The archive written in layers of earth, the library that requires no librarians, the record that preserves what no one chose to preserve, the testament to deep time and ancient power. The kingdom drawn in ash was drawn by forces that drew before and will draw again, forces whose schedule we can glimpse but cannot change, whose archive we can read but cannot rewrite. The burial is not permanent. What ash covers, erosion gradually reveals. What the sky deposited, the sky reclaims. The kingdom drawn in ash emerges slowly, century by century, as rain washes away the covering that preserved what it hid. The kingdom that returns each time it rains is the kingdom that was buried, revealing itself in fragments, in glimpses, in the gradual emergence that undoes the sudden burial. The excavation of Pompeii began in 1748 and continues today. After nearly 3 centuries of work, approximately one-third of the ancient city remains unexcavated, preserved beneath the same ash that has protected it for nearly 2 millennia. The excavators work slowly, methodically, applying techniques refined through generations of archaeological practice. But they are not the only force uncovering the buried city. Rain and wind work continuously, erosion preceding whether archaeologists are present or not. The erosion that reveals is also the erosion that destroys. What the ash preserved, exposure degrades. Frescoes that survived 17 centuries of burial fade within decades of being uncovered. Walls that stood for millennia collapse after decades of exposure to weather. The protective covering that preservation required is removed by the very process that makes preserved material accessible. The kingdom that returns each time it rains is also the kingdom that erodes each time it rains, revealed and destroyed by the same process, emerging into visibility and declining into ruin. Modern conservation efforts struggle against this paradox. Protective roofing shelters some excavated areas but cannot cover the entire site. Climate control is impossible for open air ruins. The best protection would be reburial, covering what has been uncovered, returning the preservative ash. But this would defeat the purpose of excavation, would hide what archaeology seeks to reveal, would protect what scholars need to study by making study impossible. The partial solution is documentation. Every surface that can be photographed, scanned, recorded digitally Every artifact that can be cataloged, analyzed, published, creates an archive that outlasts the original. The physical remains may erode, may eventually return to the earth that preserved them, but the information they yielded can be preserved in forms that endure beyond the material. The kingdom that returns each time it rains is not only Pompeii. Across volcanic regions, erosion continues, revealing what eruptions buried. New sites emerge from fields that have been farmed for generations. Construction projects uncover remains that no one suspected existed. The ash that preserved is gradually washed away, and what lies beneath gradually appears. Some discoveries are accidental. The terracotta army of Xi'an was found by farmers digging a well. The Iceman emerged from a melting glacier. The cave paintings at Lascaux were discovered by children exploring. The buried kingdoms reveal themselves according to no human schedule, emerging when conditions permit, surprising those who find them with evidence of pasts they did not expect. The revelation continues. Each year brings new discoveries, new glimpses of what the ash preserved, new fragments of kingdoms that were drawn and erased, and are slowly being drawn again. The rain that falls on volcanic landscapes carries away a little more of the covering, reveals a little more of what was hidden, writes a little more of the story that erosion tells. The kingdom that returns each time it rains, the gradual emergence of what was suddenly buried, the revelation that undoes the concealment, the story washed from the sky, now being washed back into visibility. The ash falls, the rain follows, the kingdom is buried, and the kingdom returns. The cycle continues, will continue, as long as the sky can give and take, as long as erosion counters deposition, as long as what is hidden seeks to emerge into the light that will eventually destroy it. Closing, the night draws toward its end, and the kingdom drawn in ash fades into the darkness from which it emerged. We have walked the streets of buried cities and climbed the slopes of sleeping mountains. We have traced the ash as it circled the globe and followed the legends as they rose from destruction into myth. We have seen the faces preserved in final expression and read the archive written in layers of earth. What remains when the ash settles and the legends fade? The recognition that our civilizations exist within parameters we do not control, the understanding that prosperity and destruction both come from forces that exceed human planning, the knowledge that what we build can be ended suddenly, preserved strangely, remembered partially, transformed into stories that future generations will tell without fully understanding what we were. The volcanic regions of the world continue their rhythms. Vesuvius sleeps, monitored by scientists who watch for signs of awakening. The caldera at Thera holds its water, its drowned center, keeping secrets that no one can reach. The mountains of Indonesia and the Philippines, of Central America and the Pacific Rim alternate between abundance and catastrophe, between the fertility that draws settlement and the destruction that punishes it. The kingdoms that were drawn in ash left traces that we can still read: archaeological remains, geological deposits, legendary accounts distorted through transmission. They remind us that permanence is not a human achievement, but a human hope that what we build today will be ruined someday, that the best we can do is create what seems worth creating and trust that something will survive. The ash falls, the kingdoms vanish, the stories rise, and in the silence that follows the thunder, in the stillness that follows the shaking of the earth, something persists. Not the buildings or the people, not the cities or the civilizations, but the memory of what was, the testimony of what existed, the faint and fading evidence that here, once, humans lived and loved and built and hoped, and were, in the end, returned to the earth that had given them everything. The kingdom drawn only in ash, its story washed from the sky, its memory preserved in the layers that record what no one chose to record, its meaning surviving in forms that change but do not quite disappear. Rest now. The ash has settled, the night is quiet, and in the darkness, the buried kingdoms wait. Wait for the rain that will reveal them. Wait for the scholars who will study them. Wait for the dreamers who will imagine them. Wait for the morning that will come again, as morning always does, bringing light to what the darkness has preserved. The end.